Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of get the word out about some things that are going on with financial aid and student loans, at least at the federal level. I do have to tell the audience that I have a bone to pick with Maggie. I specifically asked her to put a picture of Robert Redford on this cover slide, and by golly, she did not do it. So
sorry about that, Tom.
Sorry, folks, you're stuck with what you got. Anyway, so I want to talk about, again, federal student aid in these days of the coronavirus emergency. And first of all, before we get into any detail on that, I just want to say to everybody, I hope you and all your loved ones are staying safe and well during this thing. I've got to tell you, this is certainly the most far-reaching and devastating thing to hit our country probably since World War II. And it's just had a horrible effect on millions of people: illness, death, unemployment, reduced incomes, investment losses, and other types of upheavals. And some of these upheavals are affecting people who are in school with financial aid, and some of them are affecting people who have recently graduated or left college or post-secondary education and are struggling to repay their student loan debts. What I want to do today is look at some of the various forms of relief that the people in Washington have put in place, both for those ex-students in debt and for current students who rely on other forms of aid. And we'll start out kind of covering this in a chronological manner. What initially came out of Washington began as a pretty narrowly focused presidential announcement that was a pretty pale version of where we're at today. The Department of Education then put some measures into place in its role as the administrator of the federal student aid and loan programs. And then Congress got busy. And it passed a bill, which was signed into law, that covers everything from federal student loans to federal funding for emergency grants that post-secondary schools make to their students, to the federal Pell Grant program and the federal work-study program. And there are already people in Congress who are negotiating over another bill similar to that bill that's called I call the CARES Act on this slide, that could even be more helpful, or maybe not more helpful, to student aid recipients and student borrowers. First, let's go back and talk a little bit about the administrative and presidential actions. If you were sitting there on March 13th watching in the White House Rose Garden an event that was televised on almost all the networks, the president at that point finally declared a national emergency over coronavirus. But after doing that, he also made certain remarks about orders he had given to provide financial relief to Americans who were suffering financially due to the economic meltdown that coronavirus had brought on. And one of the things he said was, quote, I've waived interest on all student loans held by federal government agencies until further notice. Well, I don't think there was anybody in Washington who took issue with that, but it did leave a lot of people scratching their heads and wondering just what are student loans held by federal government agencies? And I want to be clear about that with you so you can tell if you've got student loans, whether or not they're subject to that waiver of interest. So there are three major, or there have been over the last 10 or 11 years, three major federal student loan programs. There's the program through which loans are currently getting made, which is called the Federal Direct Loan Program. There's a program that Congress ordered sort of phased out and ordered schools to stop making new loans out of it about 2 years ago, and that's the Federal Perkins Loan Program. And then if some of you were involved in post-secondary education back in 2010 or earlier, there was a program called Federal Family Education Loans. where also known as Stafford loans, where banks and other commercial lenders made loans to students, and the federal government backed them up by ensuring the repayment of those loans. Well, the Department of Education came out a few days after the president's announcement and clarified that all federal direct loans are held by federal government agencies, owned by federal government agencies, essentially. But most federal Perkins loans and most federal family education loans are not, unless the exception being loans that were sold to and are now owned by the U.S. Department of Education following a default by the borrower or some other reason that led the post-secondary school that made those loans or the commercial lender that made those loans to say, I just want to get rid of these and I'll sell them to the government. Importantly, no private, no state, and no institutional loans are held by the federal government, and it doesn't have any jurisdiction over those loans, so they're not among the loans that we're going to talk about today and go through in these slides. So the Education Department then on March 20th, a week after the president's announcement, came out and announced that not only was the buildup of interest on federally held student loans waived until further notice, but that any payments that were due on those loans were suspended for 60 days beginning March 13th. However, the department said that to get payments suspended, borrowers had to call their loan servicers, those are the companies that Washington employs to administer its student loans, to request what was called an administrative forbearance. So nothing happened automatically here. You had to call and ask for it. And that's where we stood until 12 days ago. Before those 12 days were up, really in the week following March 20th, people got really busy up on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue on Capitol Hill, and they put together a massive bill to provide economic relief to Americans and to the U.S. economy. That bill is called the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Stimulus Act of 2020, and the acronym works out to be the CARES Act. They have a habit in Congress of naming things so that the acronym sounds really good. That bill was passed and signed into law on March 27th. Now, what does it do for you as a student loan borrower? Because mostly that bill was a spending bill designed to ship federal money out to affected industries, small business loans. That's where the checks that are supposed to be coming to taxpayers by the middle of this month, that's funding those. It bolstered unemployment insurance, and it put about $100 million into healthcare facilities. But it also included certain changes in the rules and regulations for these loans held by federal government agencies. First of all, whereas you had to call and ask for a suspension of your payments in the past, those payments are now automatically suspended through September 30th of this year. So if you've been trying to get through to your loan servicer to ask for one of those forbearances that would allow you to put off your payments, don't worry about that anymore. You are going to be able to, the servicer should be stopping your payments. And if you actually got on its website and looked at your page on its website where it shows payment amounts due, that should at this point read 0. It continued the suspension or the waiver of interest accumulation Just in case you're in default or behind on your payments on these federally held student loans, it called off any kind of collection agency calls to you, and it stopped all garnishments. And a garnishment is just a confiscation by the government of something that it's legally entitled to because you defaulted on your student loans. All garnishments of federal benefits like Social Security benefits, federal tax returns, and wages that you might be earning. And that's all automatically suspended through September 30th. Now, just because your payments on federally held student loans are suspended doesn't mean you're forbidden from making payments on those loans. Ever since the federal student loan programs began in the 1950s, they've always accepted payments from borrowers at any time, even when payments weren't required. But should you even consider making payments on those loans between now and September 30th? Here are a couple points for you to think about. Obviously, only do that if you can make a payment without diminishing what you need to spend on other priorities like food, housing, transportation, things like that. Don't take food off the table for your family in order to make a student loan payment. But if you're fortunate enough to be in a financial position where you can afford to make payments, you might want to at least consider doing that because of the way interest works on federal student loans and payments are applied. So in the federal student loan programs, the first thing that always happens with any payment that's received from you is it gets applied to pay off any interest that's built up on your loan. Then everything else that's left in that payment goes to pay down the principal amount, which is the amount that future interest is builds up on. So if once your pre-March 13th interest is paid, then 100%, 100 cents on the dollar is going to reduce your principal, and that will help you wipe out your post-secondary student loan debt faster, and at less cost to you. So, again, you're not required to make payments, but you're allowed to if you can afford to. The suspended payment months, the months during which your payments are suspended, count as time accumulated for any type of federal student loan forgiveness that's tied to borrowers having made payments for a certain number of months. So if any of you are working for government agencies, federal, state, or local, or private nonprofit organizations, you might be hoping to get public service loan forgiveness, which is only available to you after 120 months during which you work for those kind of employers and make your payments. Well, the CARES Act made a change in the law and said that during these months that are marked on here, those months, even if you don't make payments, count as months that count toward your 120 months for public service loan forgiveness. And the same thing with any other federal loan forgiveness program that's based on a certain number of months during which you make payments. Also, just in case you defaulted on your federally held student loans, there is in the law right now a provision that says that you can rehabilitate that default or bring it out of default and make it a good loan again by making a certain number of monthly payments. And what the CARES Act did was say that the months during which your payments are suspended will count toward those certain number of monthly payments, even though you're not actually sending in any money. So that's something to keep in mind, and that goes far beyond where the Department of Education was going to go, because it had ruled that if payments were suspended, there's no way that the months during which they were suspended would count but Congress overrode the Department of Education. Now, remember, your payment suspension and your interest waiver or suspension ends at midnight on September 30th. The CARES Act requires the Department of Education, and the Department of Education will no doubt delegate this to your student loan servicer to send you at least 6 notices beginning in August about when your payments will resume. So let's say your normal payment due date is the 5th of every month. You'll get payments reminding you that your payments are going to start back up again on October 5th. These have to come to you by email, mail, or phone. They will also include information on the various income-driven repayment plans, which are generally plans that help you lower the amount that you pay on your loans per month, on your federal loans per month, and therefore make the payments more affordable. And if in October you're still struggling to financially recover from the coronavirus upheavals in the economy and such, you might want to really look into that income-driven repayment when you start getting these notices. But I believe they're going to show you how you can go find out more about that. It's essential that you keep your loan servicer, the party to whom you normally send payments on your federal student loans or your federally held student loans, up to date on your email address, your snail mail address, and your phone number. Otherwise, they may be sending these notices to the wrong address or calling the wrong phone numbers. And the fact that you didn't keep them up to date will not excuse you from having to begin payments again in October. So make sure you stay in contact and keep them up to date on that. And then, like I said, normal loan payments and interest accumulation are going to resume in October. However, it may be that a second CARES Act or some other action that Congress takes would suspend those things again for an even longer period of time. So you want to keep an eye out for that. And I'll, at the end of this, I'll suggest a way you can do that. Then there's a couple other things that this does. If you work for an employer who helps you make your student loan payments, or if your employer doesn't help you make your student loan payments, but you're lucky enough that they say, hey, given everything else that's going on, I'll make a payment or two for you during this coronavirus emergency, then that payment that's made can be tax deductible for the employer, and it will count as untaxed income for you, so it won't increase your federal income tax liability when you do your taxes next spring. There have to be two or three conditions met to qualify for that tax deductibility and that untaxed income provision. One is the employer can make the payments directly to the lenders, or it can make the payment directly to you to say reimburse you for payments you already made, or to give you a check that you can put in your checking account and write out an extra big check to your student loan lender at that point. And this is, by the way, I should apologize. This is not just for student loans held by federal government agencies. This is for any student loan that your employer helps you pay back. The limit on this is $5,250, so only $5,250 will be tax deductible for the employer and count as untaxed income for you. And the payments have to be made during calendar year 2020, so before next New Year's Day. But that's something you might want to keep in mind, and if you're in a great position where your employer's staying open and not having to lay people off and in pretty sound financial shape, you might look into this. One other thing that I'd like to tell you about. If your federal student loans aren't held by the government, maybe there are some of those federal Perkins loans that still still are with your school, or some of those old federal Stafford loans that are still being held by a lender other than the government. There's a way that you can get the benefits that are due to federal direct loans and other student loans held by federal government agencies. And that is to get a federal direct consolidation loan and fold your Perkins loan debt and your Stafford loan debt into that. Now, again, the federal government never does consolidation loans for private, state, or institutional loans, but it will for other federal loans. It takes, usually from the time you apply for a federal direct consolidation loan, it takes maybe 2 to 3 weeks for that money to arrive and pay off your other loans and convert those debts into student loans held by a federal government agency. So you should be able to pretty soon begin to realize the benefits of suspended payments and interest waivers and things like that. One word of caution, though. When the federal government consolidates Perkins loans and federal family education loans, it takes any interest that's owed on those loans on the date of consolidation, when it cuts the check and sends it out to your lender, and it capitalizes that. And capitalizes is just a fancy word for it adds that interest onto your loan principal, thereby inflating your principal, thereby inflating the amount of interest you'll pay in the future and making it more expensive to repay your loans. So you may want to check out how much interest you owe on Perkins loans and Stafford loans. Try to pay it off between now and when the government will consolidate those loans. And so this is about sort of what's going on with student loans in under the Federal CARES Act. I don't know, Maggie, do we have any questions yet?
Yes, Tom, I saw we just had a question come into chat, which is asking what happens if someone has private, state, or institutional loans that they're having trouble paying?
Good question. Forgive me for not addressing that. So here's the deal. Again, those loans will never get benefits from the federal government, at least not under current law. However, late last week, there was a press release from the organization that represents all the student loan servicers around the country. And in that press release, they announced that most private lenders, at least, are willing to suspend payments for a while during the coronavirus emergency. And so, but again, you have to call your loan servicer, whoever's collecting that loan on behalf of the private lender, and ask for that suspension. Now, will your any interest that builds up on your private loan be waived? That is a decision that gets made on a lender-by-lender basis. So if you contact your loan servicer and ask about getting a payment suspension on your private loans, ask about getting an interest waiver on those for the duration of your payment extension too, to find out whether or not interest is going to keep building up on those loans. On state loans and institutional loans, to the best of my knowledge, and I've looked at some state loan programs, there aren't any suspensions of payments going out, but there might be in some states. I certainly haven't been able to look at every state loan program out there, and I haven't been able to look at every institutional student loan program. So in that case, you need to call the state agency that made you a state loan, or call the post-secondary school that you attend or were attending and ask them if they would suspend your payments and maybe waive any interest that might build up during that suspension period. So while everything's automatic with with loans held by the federal government agencies, it's not automatic for private, state, or institutional loans. But I'll tell you what, it never hurts to ask. And most likely what you're going to find is that most lenders, if they can, will try to work with you at least on suspending payments. Private lenders are in the student loan business to make a profit, and so they may be pretty reluctant to waive any interest that builds up because they want to get that money sooner or later. But at least you might be able to get a payment waiver or a payment suspension. Anything else,
Okay.
Maggie?
That looks like the only question we have for now, so I will keep monitoring the chat, and if anyone has a question, they can also email info@savvyladies.org, and Tom, I'll let you know if we have more questions at the end.
Sounds good. Now, what I want to do now is look at how the CARES Act serves you or your child, if your child's a student in school relying on federal student aid programs like Pell grants and federal work study and things like that. And so let's talk a little bit about that. To understand that, you're going to have to understand a term that gets used in all of the next several slides, and that is a qualifying emergency. The qualifying emergency has to be something related to coronavirus, and it has to be declared by the President or the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, we are in a qualifying emergency right now because the President on March 13th declared a national emergency due to coronavirus. What we don't know yet is whether or not students might have to submit something to prove not only that they were living through the current national emergency, but also that something happened to them directly related to coronavirus that caused them to need to get a grant or need to do something. So that is a question yet to be answered, and everybody's watching to see how the Department of Education rules on that. But let's say that you've got a son or daughter who is in school right now, but they've been negatively affected by something related to coronavirus. Maybe they got the virus and have medical bills. Maybe they lost a part-time job or their job because their employer shut down or laid people off during the coronavirus emergency. The CARES Act makes federal money available to institutions to fund institutional emergency grants for such students. Some of that money could come from money that was allocated to institutions for what's called the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant Program, a program that normally is directed toward the absolutely poorest students in our society, and it supplements other forms of financial aid. The institution may use that money, but it's left to a decision that the institution makes. And I will tell you that we're at the point in the academic year right now where the vast majority of institutions have already committed all of their supplemental educational opportunity grant money to students and probably shipped a lot of it off to them. The big source of funding for this is a $14 billion higher education emergency fund that the CARES Act authorized and put money aside for. And that fund is going to be divided up among the nation's post-secondary schools, in part based on their overall share of the nation's enrollment of students, and in part based on their overall share of federal Pell Grant recipients, which are very low-income people. their share of that enrollment across the country. The amount that institutions could get based on those two factors could range anywhere from a few $1,000s to a few $1 million. But the government hasn't yet shipped that money out to your institution. So it's not like somebody's sitting in the financial aid office counting that money right now. The U.S. Department of Education has to use a formula that was created in the CARES Act to figure out how much goes to each institution. And just this morning, there was an article out in the higher education press mentioning that it could take as long as until late May for the Federal Department of Education to figure out how much goes out and actually deliver that money to schools. For whatever reason, Betsy DeVos's Department of Education does not work well with anything that's not extremely simple for them to understand. And so there could be a significant time lag before the school gets money. So if you need some sort of an emergency grant, go ahead and contact your school. But if they tell you that they've already used up their emergency grant money, understand that that federal money that is being allocated to them out of that higher education relief fund probably hasn't arrived yet and may not arrive for another 6-8 weeks. And bear with them. Something else that the CARES Act did. If you're a federal Pell Grant recipient, there's something called the 150% rule. And if you look down at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that here's a student who's enrolled in a program that normally takes 8 academic terms to finish. Let's say 8 semesters. Under the 150% rule, that student can get Pell Grants for as many as 12 semesters if that's what it takes for the student to get through the program. As you might guess, students who come from really low-income households have a tendency to have to drop out when the least little thing goes wrong, financially or back at home or whatever. And so it can sometimes take them longer than the normal number of semesters to get done with their programs. The CARES Act authorizes the Department of Education, which keeps track of how many semesters or how many terms a student has received Pell Grants for, to exempt from that 150% rule any term a student was unable to finish due to a qualifying emergency. Again, a coronavirus type emergency that's declared by the president or the federal government. So it's cutting students a break. And if for example, you have a son or daughter whose school closed down before they could finish the current term, or who, like I said, maybe got sick with coronavirus and had to drop out, the Pell Grant that they got for this term won't necessarily count against them in terms of the number of semesters or quarters or other academic terms for which they can get future Pell Grants. Now, Federal Work Study, the CARES Act patterned something after a recommendation from the Department of Education. If you or your child have been working at a job that was made available through the Federal Work Study program, but that job went away or got disrupted because of a qualifying emergency, the law now allows your school to pay you the rest of the Federal Work Study money that was awarded for you to earn in that job, even though you're no longer able to earn it. Now, the school may do this. It's not required to do this. And again, I just want to explain why some schools may not be in a position to do this. First of all, Federal Work Study normally pays 75% of the wages that a student earns in a work-study job. So to pay you the full amount that you would have otherwise earned, the school would have to tack an additional amount on to whatever it's paying you or whatever some off-campus employer was paying you on an hourly basis as it sends you a payment for the rest of your work study. That's a lot of money to pay out, especially at a time when the vast majority of post-secondary schools are losing tons of revenue from having their campuses open. I read an article just this morning about one institution in the Midwest that is losing now $4 million a month just in what it got from people who drove onto its campus and parked in its on-campus parking garages. Well, nobody's going to campuses anymore, and so they're losing that revenue. And also, a lot of institutions are doing partial, at least, room and board refunds, or they had to buy software so your faculty could teach you classes online. So their expenses have gone up. So it may well be that your school may not be able to pay you the full amount you would have earned, or it could be in a tough position where it can't pay you any of whatever of the additional amount you would have earned through work study. What you should do if you're interested in this, and if you did lose your job, is contact the financial aid office at your school and ask them how they're handling this. By now, I would guess that they probably have a pretty good feel for it. And so go ahead and feel free to pose the question. There's also a thing in federal student aid called Satisfactory academic progress. So, you know, everybody in their first academic term can get federal grants and work study and loans with no questions asked, as long as they meet some basic eligibility criteria. But for future terms, in order to continue to get that federal aid and those federal loans, they have to meet two standards that are called make up what's called satisfactory academic progress. One of those is keeping a GPA that's a C or higher, but they also have to complete a certain percentage of the credits that they start out taking in the term. And it's up to the post-secondary school to decide what percentage they have to complete. But let's give you an example here of a school, and this is not at all unusual, that said, hey, you've got to finish 75% of the credit hours or credits that you attempted in order to be making satisfactory academic progress. If the student completes 9 out of 12 hours, then they're at 75%. But what if, because of coronavirus, the student was only able to complete 3 credit hours instead of 9? Now they're at a 25% completion rate, and under normal satisfactory academic progress rules, that would put in jeopardy their ability to receive future federal grants, federal work study, and federal student loans. What the CARES Act did was it gave schools permission to ignore the hours that students can't complete because of a qualifying emergency. So it's cut people a break for the future there, recognizing that there's going to be a lot of people out there that are affected by this in ways that we can't even really begin to imagine right now. Then finally, federal student aid refunds. I don't know if you know this or not, but if you were a student who was in, say, a semester, and you withdrew before the 60% point of that semester, your school is required to refund to the federal government a certain percentage of any federal grant money and any federal loan money you received for that semester. If you make it to the 60% point and withdraw, there's no refund required. Well, again, schools don't, it's not like they have a ton of money sitting around. So they refund the money to the federal government, and then they turn around and they ask the students for whom they refunded that money to reimburse them for what they paid back to Washington. It's all perfectly legal, and it's the normal practice. What the CARES Act does is it says if a student was forced to withdraw before the 60% point because of a qualifying emergency, then the school is exempted from refunding money to Washington, so the student won't be required to reimburse the school for its costs of doing that. And since normally schools will prohibit students from even re-enrolling in future terms until they pay that amount, what the CARES Act has essentially done is exempted students in qualifying emergencies who withdraw due to qualifying emergencies from having to worry about this reimbursing their schools for this. One more slide. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, there's another CARES Act. It may have a totally different name that people are already beginning to talk about in Washington. There are discussions about it funding infrastructure projects, because God knows our roadways and our bridges and things like that need a lot of repair and maintenance, and that would put a lot of people back to work once the coronavirus quits, getting everybody sick. It could provide money for the states who are spending a ton of money on combating coronavirus. I watch Governor Cuomo from New York every day talk about what the state of New York is going through and the city of New York is going through. And they're not only losing lots of sales tax and state income tax revenue, but they're spending a lot more money than they ever planned to spend. So this next bill might include money for the states. It might include more money for that higher education relief fund, and there's a similar fund out there for K-12 schools. My guess is the congressional Democrats, who were the ones that were pushing loan forgiveness instead of just suspension of loan payments for students in the first CARES Act, but they got checked on that by Republicans who just folded their arms across their chest and said, we're not going to do that. That they'll make another attempt at getting some sort of loan cancellation and not just suspension of payments in the next act. That could be the act through which the September 30th date for the suspension of payments and the waiver of interest expiring gets extended out even more to even later in the year. And then there's also talk about money to fund vote by mail and remote voting projects in the state, because let's face it, folks, if this thing drags on, that may be the only safe way to vote come November in the election. Now, Democrats like that. Republicans generally don't. I'm not trying to make a political comment here. I'm just telling you what I'm reading in the media. And because Republicans are very suspicious about anything that might make it too easy for people to vote in an election when they're not really qualified to vote. And then there'll be other priorities that'll probably be funded through that next bill. When that bill comes, what will be in it, we don't know yet. But you might want to pay attention to this on the news and in the papers as that bill comes down. And certainly, if there's anything I can do to help you understand any of this, you're welcome to give me a call. You're welcome to email me. I do not charge any future, current, or ex-post-secondary students for my services. I don't charge their parents either. And I'll do anything I can to try to help them better understand what their rights and privileges are under the CARES Act and with federal student aid and such. Also, I've got my website address up on here. If you want to start becoming a follower of that website, I am posting a series of special coronavirus bulletins on there where every time something happens, say the government passes the CARES Act or rules in a particular way as to what are loans held by federal government agencies, things like that. I post that in one of those bulletins. So following that website is a very easy way to pick up information about what will happen with student aid on a going forward basis. And by the way, it also has other articles on it about things that people can do before college, during college, and after college to make college a lot more affordable to them. So you're welcome to follow that. Anyway, that's I'm now done talking. This is exciting to me, but I can only guess how many of you I've put to sleep so far. So let's go on. And Maggie, do we have any more questions right now?
Yes, we do. Thanks, Tom. And for those of you who are on the phone, I'll just read out loud. Tom's website is collegeafford.com. And if you have a question now, you can use the chat box or you can email info@savvyladies.org. And I'll start with one of the questions that we had come in earlier during your presentation, which is saying, I have a student loan that's in default. Another company has the loan, and I'm paying monthly loans for 6 months now. How can I get this loan in good standing again?
If it is a federal loan that's in default, a loan held by the federal government, call that company that's collecting from you, and first of all, tell them that you want to suspend your payments on that. Also, remember that the months that your payments are suspended will count toward the number of months you need. And if I recall correctly, it's you have to make payments for 9 out of 10 straight months. So the months where your payments are suspended will count toward those 9 months that you have to make payments. If it is another type of federal loan, say a state loan or an institutional loan, again, call that company and ask them what the party on whose behalf they're collecting those loans has instructed them to do, whether or not they're allowed to cut you any breaks on that defaulted student loan. And if they are, seriously consider and maybe take advantage of those breaks. But the only thing the CARES Act addressed was loans held by the federal government, so it doesn't have any jurisdiction over loans not held by the federal government, including those Perkins loans that may still be owned by institutions, including federal family education loans or Stafford loans that are owned by lenders, and private, state, and institutional loans. So it's a little less clear what's going to happen with those. Again, we did get a real ray of hope in that press release late last week that more and more of those lenders are willing to at least suspend payments on those loans. I hope that clears it up.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Another question for you is asking if I should call my school about my work-study income, or should I assume that they will pay out the remainder of what I'm owed?
Yeah, I would call them about that. Don't make an assumption that they'll pay out the remainder. For one thing, just for your own financial planning, you need to know for sure what's going to happen. Secondly, you need to find out whether or not they're going to pay out a percentage of the remainder or the whole remainder if they do that. And third, it could be that an institution will say, I'm only going to do this for students who call in and ask for it. Remember, the decision-making as to whether or not to make those payments in the work-study program is left up to the individual institution. So you can't count on anything happening unless you call or maybe shoot an email to the financial aid office at your school and ask them whether or not you can get that benefit.
Okay, thank you. Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure do, yeah.
Okay, so the next one is saying I had some money set aside for a vacation that I now won't be taking. Is there any benefit to using this extra money to pay off my loan while payments and interest are suspended? Would I want to direct it towards the principal?
Yeah, you could, anything that you can pay on your federally held student loans while payments are suspended, again, like I said, almost 100% of it's going to go toward principal. The only interest it might pay off is if you had a payment that you made prior to March 13th, and then in between the date you made that last payment and March 13th, you build up some more interest. So that's not going to be a lot of interest. So if you can send a payment in now, and it may be that it's very affordable for you to pay your debt in full now because all of it's going to go to pay principal, and the loan servicer or whoever's administering that loan for the government will not have to put any of it or very much of it toward interest. And that's a way you can get rid of your debt faster, and you can also pay less sort of overall in terms of paying off your debt. Now, again, two cautionary notes, one of which I already mentioned, which is, folks, don't do that if you need the money for other priorities. It sounds like this borrower is fortunate enough to have a little bit of a nest egg that he or she could use and not have to fall behind on, rent payments or mortgage payments or, buying groceries or whatever. The other thing, by the way, I'll point out, and I'm sorry, I wish I would have pointed this out at first. If you are in an income-driven repayment plan where you will get your federally held student loan balance forgiven after 240 monthly payments or 300 monthly payments, remember, these months during which your payments are suspended will count toward that 240 or 300 monthly payments, at least in terms of building up your eligibility to get the debt forgiven. Secondly, if you're in the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, this will count toward the 120 months during which you would normally be required to make payments. So you might be able to get your public service loan forgiveness after 114 months or 9.5 years instead of 10 years of payments. So take those things into account too. But if you're fortunate enough to be in a position to do this and you're not pursuing public service loan forgiveness, or you don't want your federal student loan debt to be outstanding for 240 months, which is 20 years, or 300 months, which is 25 years, hey, boy, if you can do it, pay it off now. You will never find the government, and you probably already know this, you will never find that the United States government refuses money from you for anything. So anyway, okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, the last question is saying that I read some information when this first came out about monthly payments likely not being lowered by these changes. But is there a way I can lower my monthly payments after this time period that payments are suspended?
Yes. One of the reasons that I mentioned those notices that are going to come out and how they will include information on the income-driven repayment plans that the federal government offers is that most of the time those income-driven repayment plans lower your monthly payment amounts. They still collect money from you to apply towards your loan, but they may not collect as much per month as say the standard repayment plan, which is a 10-year long repayment plan during which you pay the same amount every month. uh, from the first month you make payments to the last month you make payments. So look into those income-driven repayment plans. And if you want to, what you could do is Google federal income-driven repayment plans. And it'll get you in probably to some Department of Education websites that will explain those plans to you and even allow you to go through a federal payment estimator that could show you, comparatively speaking, how much you would pay on under various loan repayment programs. The government has 8 different repayment plans out there for you, and some of them require more monthly payment than others. So that, anyway, it's worth looking into that. The downside, by the way, of lowering your monthly payments through, say, the income-driven repayment plans is they can only lower them because they then add more months on the period during which you're expected to repay your loan. So in the long run, when you're, in your late 40s or early 50s or whatever, you may look back and go, gosh, I paid a lot more than I could have paid if I just would have hurried up my payments back when I was in my 20s. And that's true. But you know what? If you need to lower your monthly payments right now, go ahead and lower them. You can always go back later on and switch to another federal repayment plan that has higher monthly payments. Or, like I said earlier, the government never refuses a check from you. So you could send in extra money per month, even while you're on one of those income-driven repayment plans with relatively low payments.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. And Tom, just one more question for you, asking about your website and if you're creating any type of listserv or if there's anything that listeners today can sign up for, or should they just be visiting your website and checking for updated information?
If you want to email me and tell me whether or not you're somebody where you're going into post-secondary education in the future, or you're currently enrolled in college or some other post-secondary school, or now you're in a position where it's after your post-secondary education, email me your name and your email address, and I'll put it into my directory. And I'm experimenting with something right now where I go through and I list in the directory whether this is a before college, during college, or after college client. And then when I post updates to the website, I try to send a notice out by email to those clients so they can see that update. I don't know for sure if that's something I'll be able to maintain on an ongoing basis. So again, it's one of the best things you can do is just become a follower of the website, and you'll get notified whenever there's a new post up there. And by the way, to let you know, normally I post early every Wednesday morning. Now during this coronavirus emergency, I think I've already put out seven articles or blogs or whatever related to the coronavirus emergency. And for those, I don't wait till Wednesday morning necessarily. But you're welcome to either follow the website or email me, and I'll put you into my directory as one of the folks I want to notify by email. And I'm going to try to keep experimenting with that as time goes on.
Okay, great. So I'll just repeat that for everyone listening. You can email Tom at collegeafford@gmail.com, and you can visit his website is www.collegeafford.com. I encourage everyone to check out the resources that Tom has there, and we will send this out over email as well. So with that, I wanted...
By the way, folks, like I said, I don't charge for any of that stuff. I spent 40 years as a financial aid administrator and a student loan administrator getting post-secondary students deeply into debt. And when I die and go up to the pearly gates, I don't want St. Peter standing there looking in the big book and saying, Tom Melecki. Oh, you're the student loan guy. You go to hell. So I'm trying to do this for free because hopefully it'll get me grace to, not go to hell. So you may think after having sat through this webcast that all this is hell, but strangely enough, to weird people like me, it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No, just thank you again so much for all this information. Very, very thorough and very helpful. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. As I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email. And thank you so much, Tom. It was really, really helpful. And thanks for taking the time to really very clearly explain all the recent changes. We appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. And folks, anything I can do to help, let me know. Okay.
Great. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.